everyone, and welcome to another installment of Conversations at the End of the World. My name is Dorota Gozdecka, and I'm a professor at the Faculty of Law of University of Helsinki. I specialize in human rights and legal theory. And my guest today is my colleague, Kati Nieminen, Dr. Kati Nieminen, who is a lecturer in legal theory at the faculty and also a recipient of a new grant from Connor Foundation on research of criminalization of civil society activism and eroding of democratic culture. Welcome, Kati.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for talking to me. This is excellent. We have experienced so many things in the past week, especially in regards to civil society activism, protests, generally civil disobedience in all kinds of forms, really. Can you share a personal experience or a moment that deeply influenced your views on civil disobedience?
I'm deeply influenced by many historical and present acts of civil disobedience, but I guess I can't pinpoint a specific personal experience or moment that comes to mind. But what led me to talk about civil disobedience and to write about it was my interest in law and power. So what interests me is the question how the law deals with resistance and protests and actions that challenge the law in different ways. So my focus has, I guess, always been more on the law and the ways in which it relates to power than on actual civil disobedience per se.
But still, yes, you've looked at civil disobedience through that lens.
Yeah.
So, it's really a fascinating topic, especially today when so many
Yeah.
more people are standing up. So, could you tell our viewers what civil disobedience is and how it is distinguished from other forms of protests?
Yeah, there are many theories of civil disobedience, and this discussion has a long history, and there are so many aspects that we could go into. But just briefly, some most important things. Well, obviously, civil disobedience is, by definition, unlawful. It is something more than just exercising your right to express your opinion and organize a demonstration, which are lawful. Um, Also, what is often required of civil disobedience is that it's political.
Mm,
It addresses a public interest, not just your own personal
mm,
interest. So the idea is that you don't pursue your own personal gain, but instead you try to raise awareness, make a change in the society, address an injustice. Often it's also required that civil disobedience is public. It's conducted publicly, not anonymously or in secret.
mm,
Um, Another typical thing that is required is that it's non-violent. It's a peaceful form of protest. Sometimes also that it's required that you are willing to accept legal consequences for your actions. So in that way, civil disobedience, um, civil disobedience is not about just breaking the law or and accepting the potential legal consequences demonstrates commitment to the society. It's not about disrespecting the legal order in general. Um, Yet another aspect that's commonly associated with civil disobedience is that it's the last resort. So all other avenues have been exhausted.
mm,
In a democratic society, there are many ways to express opinion, address an injustice, raise awareness, take things to court, for example. So sometimes it's required that uh, before you resort to civil disobedience, you try other ways of addressing your community. Um, but there are problems related to all these requirements, if you will. for instance, it's not always clear what is legal or illegal, what's unlawful and what's unlawful. It's a debated issue, and it's not always, you can't always know it beforehand. Sometimes it's only in retrospect that this assessment is made, so it's not clear cut, which already complicates the whole question. And also recently we have witnessed in the so-called Western world attempts to limit the space for legal demonstrations and protests. So we perhaps need to rethink, like, is this what does it mean if something is lawful or unlawful? For example, Amnesty International just recently criticized attempts in Italy to introduce new legislation that would seriously impact the right to protest. For example, blocking traffic could attract a prison sentence up to 2 years. And this is not happening, obviously, only in Italy. There are similar examples from France, Spain, UK, Sweden, and even the UN Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders, Michel Forst, has expressed concern over the limitations to right to protest. So the question is, how should this kind of trend impact our assessment of the justifiability of civil disobedience in relation to law? Still, again, what is political? Is conscientious objection political? I think it is often, but if we think about Hannah Arendt's definition of the political, then perhaps not. So all these requirements are difficult. And if I still may continue, what is violent? While it might seem that violence is easily identifiable, it's not always the case. Claiming that something is violent can also be a strategic thing, a speech act, so to speak. And history shows us that even peaceful sit-ins can be perceived violent by some. And finally, how many avenues we need to try before it's justifiable to resort to civil disobedience. How do we know that all other avenues of change have been tested? And in theory, you can always take things to court. You can always write another letter to your representatives, etc. And how long should we wait before resorting to acts of civil disobedience? But what?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. Continue. You were still saying.
This is a complicated issue, obviously, but we can also ask perhaps what civil disobedience is not. It's not ordinary criminality where there's no public or political aim and where one only seeks to gain personal advantage. It's also usually not revolutionary. It shows commitment to your democratic society. But then again, well, maybe if you think about what Gandhi did, who's like the figurehead of civil disobedience, you could say that what he actually pursued was revolutionary. But the problem with trying to define civil disobedience is that we are trying to do two things at the same time. We are trying to describe civil disobedience and to prescribe it. That is, we try to articulate the circumstances in which disobedience is acceptable. And that's why it's so tricky to define civil disobedience. What we should remember, however, is that the context matters. If we think about John Rawls's famous definition of civil disobedience, we need to remember that he described disobedience in what he called nearly just society. So what I've said about the parameters of civil disobedience apply according to Rawls and others in a society that is not thoroughly unjust, where there are, for instance, legal avenues for resistance. And one could say that we need the proper context of discussion is a democratic society.
That's right. And that's where we have a problem at the moment.
Exactly.
So many boundaries are so rapidly shifting, including the boundaries of what's legal and what's not legal. You have really like beautifully outlined that picture of what it is and what it isn't, and how many complications there are in defining civil disobedience. I have a question then. What role does the Civil Disobedience Act play in supporting or challenging democracy? Because democracy is what's at stake at the moment. So, what's the role of civil disobedience in supporting or challenging democracy?
This is a really good question, because often people who don't like civil disobedience claim that there are in a democratic society there are other ways to make a change. But in my opinion, like I said, a democratic society is the only proper context for civil disobedience, because civil disobedience, at least the way I understand it, does not challenge the democratic system. That's the whole point. It's not revolutionary in the sense of trying to overthrow a democratically elected government or to erode the democratic system and its structures, but even perhaps support it and supplement it.
That's right. Um, where do we draw the line then? Because you talked about those lines, but like where can we draw the line between acts of civil disobedience that support democracy and those that threaten democracy?
Yeah. The theories of civil disobedience and the definitions I refer to often don't really say anything about what are the aims that can be pursued by civil disobedience. So the way in which civil disobedience is most often defined does not necessarily contain any explicit restriction on what are the justifiable aims of disobedience. However, some elements in the typical definitions of civil disobedience contain, at least implicitly, a premise that civil disobedience is not acceptable if the aim is to undermine the democratic structures of the society. But it should be remembered, however, that we do not all agree on what democracy even is and who should be included in the democratic community. And again, here's where it gets tricky. And this is also the reason why I find prescriptive definitions of civil disobedience difficult. So it's really difficult to, do two things at the same time, to describe something and to like prescribe it in a way that, like, when is it acceptable? Um, But for sure, I think that acceptable civil disobedience does not pursue authoritarian aims or discriminatory policies. So that's where I draw the line. But now, if we think about the protests in Los Angeles and elsewhere in the US, we need to take into account the context in which they are taking place. The federal government is not acting normally, and we should consider the question, what happens to the justification of civil disobedience if the democratic premises and foundations of the legal order are challenged by the state itself? What if the government is not committed to democracy? does not respect human rights, does not engage in dialogue with the political community. And I'm not saying that the US is no longer a democracy or that anything goes, but there seems to be a struggle going on over what kind of democracy, what kind of society the US will be in the future. And I think this complicates the assessment of what types of acts of disobedience, resistance, and protests should be considered legitimate and justified.
Yes, you mentioned Los Angeles. The recent events included the threat of using military force to quell those protests. And you also mentioned previously this global tendency to limit certain types of protests. What are the risks for those who protest or perform acts of civil disobedience? What should they be aware of?
Yeah. Well, in Los Angeles and elsewhere in the US, the recent response to protests have been really harsh and concerning, as the response is not one that you would expect in a democratic society that is based on freedoms, such as freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And to me, it seems that the aim is not only to stop the demonstrations, but also to establish a new normal, to introduce new elements into the societal structure, and perhaps even to erode the democratic foundation of the society, at least to some extent. And this is what worries me the most, as it does indicate a higher risk for the democratic structures of the society, and also for individual protesters who can really face harsh consequences that perhaps exceed what would be normally considered proportional. In a larger context, there is, like you said, a growing trend of limiting the space for acceptable protests in the so-called Western societies. New legislations and criminalizations are being introduced in various European countries that aim to prevent protests, or at least certain types of protests, to stigmatize protesting and to make it seem like all kinds of disruptions to daily life are crime. We should remember that causing disruption for traffic, for instance, does not automatically mean that the protest is illegal or illegitimate. So besides the personal risks that protesters face, there is a risk that our societies become more intolerant of protesting and political participation outside of elections in general. And this is a risk for democracy, in my opinion. One thing I'd like to still add, that we need to remember that when we talk about civil disobedience, that we should also defend the space for legal protests, and not too readily perhaps describe our protests as civil disobedience for strategical reasons, because otherwise we risk limiting the legally acceptable ways of protesting. So not every roadblock is an act of civil disobedience, but just normal legal protesting. But obviously it's a strong strong message if you are willing, if you are publicly announcing your willingness to engage with civil disobedience. That's a strong message, but we also need to defend the space for legal acts of protests.
Beautifully drawn distinction here that, like, not all protest is illegal, that, there's a line somewhere that unfortunately seems to be shifting, but still,
Exactly.
in normal democracy, the right to protest ought to exist.
Yeah.
Let's kind of get to a little bit of a practical question. What guidance would you offer to those considering acts of protest in this sort of changing landscape, or acts of civil disobedience?
Well, being aware of the risks, and preparing for them is obviously important. I'm not a specialist on this, but there are like really practical uh, information out there. Should you have your phone with you? Should you even wear makeup if there's a risk that the police is using mace or something? Like really practical tips for protecting yourself. Um, and I'm not an expert on those. But to prepare, be aware of the risks. And well, another important thing I think is to find allies, to build communities, to act together, because the whole idea of protesting, it's a communal thing. It's powerful because it's a mass,
Yeah,
hopefully.
the community coming together. That's right.
Community coming together, exactly.
Yeah, well, it's not like we saying here, go and protest everything. But if you are considering in those circumstances, you need to know the legalities, I think, at the very least.
Yeah.
You need to know what you're facing potentially.
No, yeah, and know your rights, and yeah,
That's right.
exactly.
Well, in this very complicated world that we're living in, where democracy seems to be under significant stress, all these shifting lines that you've mentioned are happening all across the globe. And, we see them, well, more clearly or less clearly in different contexts. Where do you find hope? Is there any hope? And, or should we expect to have to perform acts of civil disobedience to preserve our democratic values?
Oh, this is a good question. Should we be expected or
Mm.
prepare for
Prepared,
uh,
maybe, yes, prepared,
yeah,
better
be
word.
to defend democracy, even using acts of civil disobedience if nothing else
Mm,
works. Um, there are, of course, many ways to defend democracy and democratic values, and we can all find ones that we can commit to. But I definitely think that we should be alert.
mm,
We should stay aware of what's going on and not let things slide. And this is, I guess, where hope comes into it. We should not lose hope. We um, should take care of each other and build communities, but also not just hope, not just hope that things will be
mm,
fine and everything will be normal without any input from anyone. So yeah, it's important to not lose hope, but not only uh, just hope that everything will be fine. Um, and there is hope. Like in the academic world, if because that's my home field, I'm really thankful, and it gives me hope that we, like you mentioned in the beginning, just received funding for a research project that would not only um, investigate the ways of securitization and criminalization of activism, but also hopefully to be able to contribute something that builds strength in the civil society.
mm.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
There is always hope, and I think, like you said, we shouldn't give up on it. It's so
no,
easy to capitulate in advance, and I think that
yeah,
it seems to be the problem that modern societies face, that a lot of people capitulate in advance, and that really helps those lines to shift. And that's quite problematic, especially where lines seem to be shifting simultaneously in different
oh yeah,
places all at once. So yeah,
yeah.
thank you
It's
for,
scary,
yeah, it's very, very,
but there's hope.
there is hope. Yes, thank you. And thank you for kind of, I guess, underlining the role of community, because that's really
Yeah,
where we can find the strength coming together and defending democratic culture. Thank you so much, Kati, for this conversation. And
Thank you.
congratulations on the grant. I think it's going to be
Thanks.
a really fascinating project, and looking forward to reading your research results and finding out more how you're tracing all these changes in the shifting landscape of our global democracy. Thank you so much to our viewers. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like and subscribe. We have hit 18 subscribers on YouTube. What a success. Please support us. The algorithm does not support us at the moment. We are still too small, but I know from people who watch this that they do enjoy. So please encourage your friends and your community to subscribe so we can win with the algorithm. I always call it a little war with the algorithm. Thank you so much again, Kati, and thank you to our viewers, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much.